Right. Well, the webinar has now started. Um, we'll just give a few minutes, a few moments, probably not minutes, for people to join. It's currently it's going up faster than my oven in temperature, which seems to take a long time. We're currently at 77, 79, and in a few moments we're going to be listening to self-confessed penny pincher Rob Ainsley. Although I have written down here a more flattering comparison. The Martin Lewis of the cycling world I've written.
That's
Is
that's what I should have said. That's
yeah,
what I should have said. See, ask an author, she'll get a better result.
yeah. But according to you, you are a veteran penny pincher, hence the subject of this talk. But before we get to that, a few reminders. This is now the pre-penultimate talk of the online festival. Hope you've enjoyed lots of the talks so far, but there are two more to go after Rob. A talk about Cambodia, and then finally a talk about the not the Outer Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides. So that should be quite interesting. Um, and Before we go on, hopefully lots of you have contributed because obviously Tim and Laura, they do all this for free, as do the speakers. But there are costs involved. So hopefully you have, if you're able to, and if you're in a position to do so, you've donated. The recommendation is £5 per talk or £20 if you have seen lots of them, and I have to say it's very, very good value. Um, and I'm sure Rob will be very, very good value in a few moments. I first met Rob at the Peace Hall in Halifax. So the background behind me is in honour. If you were in the talk earlier, Laura mentioned Halifax. So hello, Peter. Hello, Piers. Hello, Steve. You're the other three people at least from Halifax who normally join these things. Um, and Yeah, you can see the piece all behind me. So that's an advert for Halifax. Come and visit us. Right. Without further ado, I think the plan, having spoken to Rob a few minutes ago, is for him to speak for 20, 25 minutes. He's, and clearly there's going to be a musical interlude in that at some point. Um, he is very, very keen to hear your ideas. So please make sure that you're using ideally the Q&A section, but I will be monitoring the chat function. If you do put things in the chat function, just make sure that you put your messages to everyone rather than to just the host and the panelists, because I'm sure everybody would like to benefit from your words of wisdom. Do you know Tina Smith, Rob?
I don't. I haven't met Tina. Hello, Tina.
She's
I,
in York apparently. She's just signed on, so say hello. I can see Piers is here. In fact, Piers is doing the CTC talk on Friday. So if you happen to be in Halifax, come and listen to Piers. He's got a fascinating story to tell. Right, I'm going to shut up and over to you, Rob. Good luck.
money, money, money. That's what we're talking about. That's what ABBA sang about in 1976. Their thesis being, it's a rich man's world. And they're not wrong. But as we know, you don't have to be rich and you don't have to be a man to enjoy cycle touring. And what we'll be talking about today is how to get the best value cycle touring, how to save a few quid here and there and spend it on the things you really want to enjoy. For me, that is culture. I like exploring the culture of a place, particularly the sort of culture that you can fry or uncork. I'll also be talking about this trip I did, a week's tour for under 100 quid, going from Llanfairpwll, gwyngyll, gogery, chwyrn, drobwll, llantysilio, gogogoch, to Gorsafawddach, aidraig, ddanhedd, ogleddol, lônpenrhyn, areurdraeth, ceredigion. Easy for you to say. Um, I mentioned ABBA. Would you like to see a picture of ABBA riding bikes? Let's see a picture of ABBA riding bikes. Here they are in Sweden, in Stockholm, circa 1974. One thing I would say is Annie Frid and even Benny and Bjorn, your saddles are a bit low there. I would have put them a bit higher. That's enough about ABBA. Talking about the costs of going cycle touring, and just to establish a couple of bounds. What's the lower bound? What's the cheapest you can do it for? Well, the cheapest you can do it for is 0, and some people have. In 2014, Tom Allen, who's a blogger and cycle tourer, he went from Land's End to John O'Groats without spending literally anything at all. And people have done this kind of thing. So that at the one end, you can do it in theory for 0. At the other end, if you're going on some top-end guided tours, well, you can pay this sort of money. I picked this one because a friend of mine has just done it, and he said it was fabulous, following in the footsteps of Che Guevara in Argentina and Chile. And these are guided tours, but top-end guided tours where you're staying at really luxurious hotels and having gourmet food with wine pairing and so on. 14 nights for one person works out at nearly £9,000, about 600 quid a day. That's what most of us would pay for a couple of weeks. Now, I'm not sneering at this. I'm just saying these are the sort of bounds that we're talking about. But most of us, I think, would be towards the left-hand side of this graph that I've just put together. And I've put together some kind of modes of traveling. So at the cheapest end, you've got wild camping and subsistence food, which is the sort of thing that if you're on a really big epic trip going around the world, then you'll be probably down at that end. And there's camping, self-catering. Up from there is hostels and cheap eats. And more than that is hotels and budget restaurants. And at the top end, you've got those guided tours. Now, I think most of us tend to operate in those middle 3 bands. I know I do. And there's nothing, none of these are correct. None of these are wrong. I often mix and match these in the context of one trip. It might be a cycle camping trip, but I'll spend a night or 2 in a hostel or a hotel when the weather gets really bad. And these are all very fuzzy boundaries. But here's some of the trips I've done in the last year or so, just to give you an idea of the kind of costs that I'm looking at. And these 3 trips are among the top end of what I generally pay. I do a lot of traveling, and so I like keeping the costs down when I can. Just trying to get rid of that thing off my screen. There we go. So just over a year ago, I did the Portugal end-to-end with a good friend of mine, Nigel. There he is in the picture. And that was 2 weeks on touring bikes, standard touring bikes, staying at hotels, eating out most nights, enjoying a drink or 2 most nights. And that worked out as about £53 a day. And that's including absolutely everything, all the transport there, all the transport back, everything we spent. So it's not just the day-to-day expenses, that's the whole thing. And that's sort of at the top end that I'd spend, but that was a very comfortable and enjoyable trip. Last autumn, I did the Loire Valley. That was cycle camping, but a few nights in hostels because the weather wasn't great. And that worked out as 650 quid for 2 weeks, £47 a day. Almost half of that was getting there and getting back on the train. But it wasn't a penny pinching trip by any means, because I was eating and drinking and enjoying it and grazing during the day at patisseries and bakeries and so on. Last month, I was in Basque Country, went to Bilbao and Donostia, San Sebastian, with a folding bike. And that was a trip very much for eating and drinking. That was exploring the pinchos culture of the Basque Country. And that worked out about 300 quid for the week, about £44 a day. So not skimping at all. That was enjoying the food and drink, but staying in hostels. And down at the cheaper end, 3 trips that I did last year. One to the Lake District, that was 5 nights for 125 quid, thanks to youth hostels being very cheap at that time of year. They were 15 quid a night. A trip I did to the Trossachs and Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland, that was 5 nights for 100 quid, so almost a week for 100 quid. And that was with a tent, but 1 night in a hostel and 1 night at a campsite, but 3 nights wild camping. I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'll also talk about the trip to Northwest Wales, which was on the title panel for this talk. And that's, again, was 5 nights for 100 quid, 20 quid a day. That was for a magazine article, as well as the Trossachs trip, which was also for a magazine article. I'll talk about the Trossachs trip briefly. You'll see for all of these cheap trips, the train costs were at or near zero. And I'll talk about how I managed that a bit later. The Trossachs trip, which was for a couple of magazine articles, that gives you an idea of where it was. I was going around the Trossachs lakes, which are lakier than the Lake District. It's up around Loch Lomond, around there. But I think more pleasant to ride around because the roads are much quieter. I also went up Llanfairpwll, which was one of the great hill climbs. If you saw Simon Warren's talk on the other night, he was talking about Great Ddanhedd in England, which is his top climb in Britain. Llanfairpwll is very similar. I'll talk about that in a second. And I also went around Dumfries and Galloway, which is a very empty part of the country and very pleasant cycle touring. This is the road up to Llanfairpwll. There's a national air traffic control radar at the top, and the access road is banned to public traffic, but you can cycle up it, which is what makes it a fabulous climb. You go up to about 730 meters. That's the air traffic control station at the top, known locally as the golf ball for obvious reasons, and spectacular views from the top, wonderful panoramas. I also went round a load of lakes. I was doing some lake bagging, and I went round all of those and did a bit of wild camping, which you can do in Scotland, of course. One notable lake up there is Lake Catrin, number 8 at the top left-hand corner, because that road, the orange road that you can see goes along the north coast, that is also traffic-free. It's a tarmac road, but only locals are allowed to use it. There's a handful of houses along there, but it's essentially a traffic-free road. Lots of scenery like this, lots of this kind of stuff. And that's the road along the shore of Lake Catrin. That was one of my wild camping spots. Not quite as deserted as it looks. There were 3 other people camping behind me, but a lovely place to spend the night, except for the midges. There was millions of midges and I got munched, absolutely. So that was one £100 trip for a week. This was another £100 trip for the week. And again, you'll see very, very small outlay on trains, and I'll explain how in a bit. 5 nights, 100 quid, 20 quid a day. And I wanted to make this, because it was for a magazine article, I wanted to give it a gimmick, a hook. And I thought, what's the biggest trip that you can do in Britain? Not in terms of distance, but in terms of word length. What's the longest 2 place names? And it turns out the longest 2 place names are the unofficial place names of Llanfairpwll, gwyngyll, gogery, drobwll, llantysilio, gogogoch, and Gorsafawddach, aidraig, ddanhedd, ogleddol, lônpenrhyn, areurdraeth, ceredigion. They're both railway stations in North Wales. They're about 60 miles apart, and that made an ideal plan for the trip. And it got me looking at long place names, and these are the longest place names I could find in terms of single word place name. I think might be Killingwoldgraves, which is a hamlet near Beverley in East Yorkshire. The longest hyphenated one is Sutton-under-Whitstone Cliff, which is in North Yorkshire, bottom of Sutton Bank. The longest multiple place name is North Leverton with Habblesthorpe in Lincolnshire, I guess, or is it Leicestershire? The shortest is A, and even the name of the country that I live in is apparently the longest country name in the world. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is the longest country name in the world. North Leverton with Habblesthorpe, it actually has a slightly longer version even of that name. It's North Leverton with Habblesthorpe, check your speed. There's which is pretty good for cycling, actually. There's a lot of mountain bike routes around there. And there's also quite a few gravel tracks through the forest. And the roads are really quiet if you're just doing road cycling. A nice part of the world to explore. But yeah, the main focus of my trip was this in northwest Wales. And so I thought I'd cycle from the one long name to the other long name. I won't say them again because we've only got an hour for the talk. I'd never been around the Llyn Peninsula, that peninsula on the left-hand side. So I explored that as well. And that was what I did for 6 days, 5 nights, cycle camping. Did I manage it for under 100 quid, including the train out and back? Yes, just about. A little bit of creative accounting, but we managed it. On the way out, there was problems with the trains, and you'll see this was actually quite a good thing. The train got into Llandudno Junction, and it then separated. The front half of the train went on to Llanfairpwll, etc., where I was heading, but the rear half of the train stayed in Llandudno Junction. They hadn't told us the train was going to split. There was no notices about it. The conductor never came through the train to tell us. There was no signs on the onboard train display, nothing. So me and various other people were left stranded in Llandudno Junction. But on a biker course, not a problem, because I could be flexible. And so I realized I could camp in Llanfairpwll, a few miles away, about 10 miles. So hopped on my bike, cycled along National Cycle Network Route 5, which goes along the coast, and nice sunny evening, and got to this campsite, which was 10 quid. How did I know about the campsite? Well, I'll tell you about that later. Very nice evening, actually. There was a group of German civil engineering students on a field trip, looking around things like Menai Suspension Bridge, the Iron Bridge in Ironbridge, and they were very impressed by all this, heritage technology, and it was nice to know that Britain still leads the world in 200-year-old civil engineering. So next day I got to Llanfairpwll gwyngyll. That's the official version of the name. The longer version of the name was concocted in the 1800s as a publicity stunt, basically, a marketing ruse. But the name stuck, and people have embraced it. And you can see it all around the village or town. It's there at the railway station, full name. It's there on the co-op, which I think is great. There's a souvenir shop which has all sorts of merch that you can buy with the long name. And my favourite is the Volvo concessionaires. It has the long version of the name. Absolutely straight-faced. I love that. So I set off down towards the Llyn Peninsula, edge of Snowdonia, through places like Carnarvon, along roads like this, cutting in between these very dramatic, quite gritty and slaty Welsh mountains on the edge of Snowdonia. Plenty of this kind of thing. And got to Beddgelert, the village of Beddgelert, a very characterful, very picturesque little village. I couldn't resist putting that photo in black and white just to give it the atmosphere. You can visit the grave of the legendary dog Gelert. It probably never existed. There's a story that's probably a load of cobblers, but it's a bit of fun to visit the purported grave. And then I headed into the Llyn Peninsula, and never been there before, and a lot of it seemed like this, fairly flat roads winding between and round quite lumpy mountains. Quite picturesque, plenty of places to camp, plenty of picturesque villages. This one is Llangyan, and it was very nice for me to see that in shops like this is the local shop in Llangyan, that people are still speaking Welsh. And it's something I just love about travel, is trying to make a fool of myself in another language. So I was very happy to give my Welsh a go, and that always went down well. I love the way that languages encode cultures, encode their view of the world, and they're priceless artifacts that I think are well worth preserving and well worth spending a few quid of public money to keep them vibrant and alive, as has happened with Welsh, thanks in part to Llanfairpwll Cymru, S4C, Channel 4 Wales, and various other moves. This is Mynydd Rhyw, the largest, biggest hill that you can cycle around on the Llyn Peninsula. There's a track up to the top. It's all very nice to explore. Fabulous views. You can see just in the distance there, that's the western end of the Llyn Peninsula. And quite a few good beaches, some little villages on the coast. So lots of this kind of view. A gegin fawr, which was a little historic cafe, lots of little old historic places to eat and drink, which was great fun, and I could try out my Welsh again in this. It turned out my friends Si and Sue, my good friends Si and Sue, were in the area. So we could meet spontaneously at a campsite. Again, thanks to the flexibility of cycling, we could both meet up. That's their camper van there. That night, Storm Lillian blew in and there were 70-mile-an-hour gusts, and I managed to survive it. And there's a bit of a story behind that. I spent a lot of that evening, a lot of that night in the campsite toilet doing Sudoku. Lots of Welsh being talked about, being spoken in the pubs, which always delights me, and some good local real ale for £4. So I treat myself to a few bargain local beers. And again, to stress when I'm talking about penny pinching, the idea is still to have a good time. It's not to be miserable and embrace austerity. It's to make sure that you're not paying over the odds and that you can save that money and spend it on the things that you really enjoy, which for me is the food and drink. Fabulous campsite at Cricieth, which was very busy with caravans and camper vans, but the campers field was empty. I had it to myself. This place was 10 quid to stay, and lovely views of the mountains, and a beautiful evening of solitude, and my self-catering with a trangia there in the evening. Having explored the Llyn Peninsula, I was heading to the second long place named Gorsafawddach, etc. And I went past Harlech and Barmouth. And these are famous for Harlech having the supposed steepest hill in Britain and Barmouth having an extraordinary bridge. This is the steep hill, llanfairpwll, which goes from where the castle is on the top of the ridge down to the bottom of Harlech. And it's the only signed 40% road gradient in Britain. There is apparently a 40% gradient on a cycle path in Scotland somewhere, but this is the only one on a road. And it's the steepest downhill cycle in Britain. Not uphill, because it's one way. You can't cycle up it. And that's what it looks like at the steepest point. And you can see that is really steep. But it's not actually the steepest hill in Britain, never mind in the world. Steepest hill in the world is Baldwin Street in New Zealand. And I reckon the steepest hill in Britain is actually Church Lane in Whitby, which I think from the evidence of that photo is about 50% near the bottom. It all comes down to what your definition of street is and steepest. Where are you measuring the gradient? In the middle of the road, at the edge? Are you measuring it over an average over 5 meters, 10 meters, or what? Does it have to have buildings on both sides, or just one side, or whatever? But for me, Church Lane, Whitby, is actually the steepest. But back to Wales, and this is Barmouth, which was near the end of my trip. Another very pleasant little micro pub and brewery in Barmouth, where I had another very reasonably priced cask beer, £4, not in London now. And there's the bridge. This is the main cycling attraction of Barmouth, and It's virtually all made of wood. There's that bit made of metal that you can see with the two sort of arches. But it goes across the mouth of the Llanfairpwll estuary, and when you cycle it, you go across these planks, these Victorian era planks, and it's like cycling a giant marimba. And it's quite an experience cycling right across that bridge. And it's traffic free, of course. There's only trains and bikes and pedestrians use that. Lovely views. And I finally got to Llanfairpwll, which is just south of Barmouth. It's just the opposite side of the estuary, to Golfholt. Golfholt is the official name of this little stop on the Heritage Railway, the Llanfairpwll Railway. And this is the place where you have that monster name. They renamed it as a gimmick, a bit like Llanfairpwll did in the 1880s. Llanfairpwll Railway did it in the 1980s, gave the station this long name, but it never really stuck. And the only place now that you can see that long name is on that halt sign right there. So that was my trip, but what I want to talk about now is techniques and tricks and tips for saving money. So this is where I welcome your contributions. I'll talk about some of the things I've learned over the years for saving money. I'll talk briefly about a few of them over the next 5 minutes, and then there's a chance for you to have a think about how to contribute. So you will see this list. This list will come up later on. I'll leave it on screen for a few minutes, but I'll be talking about transport, accommodation, and food. Accommodation is usually the big expense, but also can be transport. For transport, the big tip is delay repay. In my experience, when I travel by train out to start a tour from York to somewhere in Britain, about 1 in 4 times or 1 in 3 times, the train is more than an hour late. There's usually a multi-leg journey and one of the legs is late and you miss your connection, and that means you arrive late. If you're more than an hour late, through delay repay, you can claim all of your money back. And like I say, this often happens. But there's more, because the train company that caused you to be late is the one you go to claim your money back. If that's Northern, there's an extra option. Northern Trains has a very wide area. It covers pretty much all of the north of England, and it happens to be my local train operating company. And so I live in York, which is in the middle of that, and I could get up to Carlisle or across to Manchester or down to Stoke or Nottingham. And Northern, as I believe uniquely among train operating companies, has an extra option for delay repay. This one simple trick that most delay repay claimants don't know about is down here. You can see it says show slower options. Now, if you click that, that gives you the option of getting a complimentary ticket. 1 hour's delay means you can claim a complimentary return anywhere on the network. If it's half an hour, you get a complimentary single. If it's 2 hours delay, you get 2 complimentary returns. And because I travel a lot by Northern and because there's a lot of late trains, I have a regular supply of these complimentary tickets. And the complimentary tickets are great because they can be worth, in nominally 50, 60 quid, particularly because you can use them on peak services. So you could go on the morning train out to wherever. And I use these very regularly to effectively travel for free up to the lakes or into the Yorkshire Dales or the Yorkshire Moors and so on. And that's how I managed to do some of those trips I talked about earlier, going to the Lake District. That cost me no money at all because I could get there by Northern for free with one of these tickets. That's how I got up to Scotland very cheap, because I could get up to Carlisle for free using one of these tickets and then just get a local train over into Scotland and so on. Another tip, some buses take bikes. There's not many, but there's a few. Some services around Edinburgh and in the borders in Northumberland. And this one, which again is local to me, the X46 between York and Hull, takes bikes for free. Do let me know if you know any bus services which take bikes, because particularly with the £3 flat fare as it is at the moment, there's some very cheap ways of moving around with your bike. Accommodation, yeah, I mentioned camping, and this is absolute gold dust if you're a cycle camper. The Google map, Cycle Camping UK. You can find it with a Google search. Cycle Camping UK, an initiative of Neil Whedon, who I think may have spoken here before, is a list of campsites which are cycle friendly and affordable. So they're all, I think, £17 or under, but many of them are much less than that. Many of them are £10, £12, and you know they're cycle friendly. There are obviously lots of campsite websites, campsite listings out there, but you always have to keep clicking through the individual campsites to see if they take bikes and how much they cost. This website is great. This is the one that enabled me when I was in North Wales to look and say, when my train got stranded, I can go to Llanfairpwll for 10 quid and camp there. And that's what I did. So do make a note of that and do visit that website. I'm very happy in hotels, and there's some great bargains to be had from some of the chains. They often do offers, especially in the out of season. Premier Inn, I've stayed there often for the low £30s. Travelodge, I stayed just last month, one in Milton Keynes, for 26 quid. And it had a bath. And that, for me, that's just sitting in a bath after a day's cycling with a cup of tea or a glass of wine. That's luxury for me, and at a very reasonable price. Youth hostels can be really cheap. Again, especially watch out for the winter bargains. 15 quid, even less if you're a member. So yeah, that was the one I stayed at when I went to the lakes, and as you can see, a very nice place to stay. Vrienden op de Fiets, worth mentioning, a scheme in the Netherlands that is peer-to-peer cyclist hospitality. You pay a flat rate of €25, and a cyclist will put you up and give you breakfast. I stayed in a houseboat last year, just outside Amsterdam, and that was great. Very, very Dutch. Lots of independent hostels can be found only through a Google search. There's lots of independent hostels that are not on booking.com or one of those websites. I found this bird observatory, for example, in Spurn in East Yorkshire, which is also a hostel. You don't have to be a bird spotter to stay there. And there's various other places which I found, Quaker meeting houses, sports clubs, and so on. And this bird observatory, which I stayed at in November, it was great because it was there's quite a few bird people staying there who were doing voluntary work, or there were rangers, that kind of thing, all staying there. And in the evening, we're sat there having our dinner, me with my self-catering, then with a takeaway, and suddenly somebody shouts, "They've got a shorty! They've got a shorty!" And he turns to me and says, "Do you want to see a shorty?" So, of course, I said yes. Had no idea what he was talking about. And we all got up and we all ran off through the woods, and then got to this little hut in pitch dark in the middle of nowhere. And that was the shorty. It was a short-eared owl. They'd got a short-eared owl that they'd caught for ringing. And I felt like I was a presenter on Country File. It's great. There's all these rangers and bird people, and they're all measuring the owl and ringing it and stuff. And so that was a lovely little experience that I got from that trip. So yeah, keep an eye open for non-standard accommodation. Talking about food, yeah, I often enjoy the good deals that you get from some chains. Sometimes it feels like every other shop on the high street is a Greggs. Well, in Jarrow in 2014, every other shop was a Greggs because they had two Greggs, just one shop apart. I'm quite a fan of Greggs's morning deal, £2.75 or thereabouts for a bacon roll and coffee. Wetherspoons, I enjoyed a pint on my way to the Basque trip that I mentioned when I went to the Eurostar train with my folding bike. A pint in Wetherspoons for £3.65 in London. That's like half the price of most beer in London. And I'm quite a fan of Wetherspoons afternoon deals, 2 till 5. Between 2 and 5, you can get very, very inexpensive meals, including a drink, fish and chips for £8, £9, that kind of thing. But you now have a choice. You can listen to me singing a funny song about bikes. The funny song being Gary Numan's Cars. This was the last #1 song of the 1970s. It's not a song in praise of cars at all. The original Cars was not saying cars were great. It was a song about alienation. It was a searing indictment of the problems caused by over-reliance on personalised motor transport. So I've rewritten the words to make it funny and about bikes. And it's a sort of song about the N+1 business, about all the different bikes that we have and their advantages and disadvantages. So you can listen to that, or you can look at this list of cost-cutting techniques and think of your own cost-cutting techniques, and we'll talk about them for the rest of this session. But first of all, here's that song, and there's your list. Here on my bike, I can go where I like, and I certainly will, if it isn't uphill on bikes. Here on my folder, if the weather gets colder and I feel like a wuss, I can go on the bus on bikes. Here on our tandem, things don't go as we planned them, and it can be a pain if we travel by train on bikes. Here on my gravel bike, I easily travel like on roads, tracks or sand, but it cost me £6 on bikes. Here on my MTB, I feel totally free, but I get rushes of blood and I get covered in mud on bikes. On my e-bike I ride, and uphill I can glide, but it's ever so large and takes hours to charge. Oh, bikes. Right, that's enough of Gary Numan. Now we can have the discussion.
Right, thank you, Rob. Well, lots of people have been mentioning lots of things, including quite a few things that you've actually already mentioned. So people have mentioned warm showers, of course, and vrienden op de fiets. Graham does point out, however, that warm showers usually isn't really free because very often you end up giving a gift of something, which is a fair point. Um, he also says avoid Switzerland and Norway, although my experiences of cycling in Switzerland and Norway, um, if you're camping and if you find things which are cheap in the supermarket, it's a relatively, I wouldn't say it's cheap, but it's not necessarily expensive to do that. There's a few
Yeah.
more sites that have been mentioned. Welcome to My Garden, you mentioned, but also Home Camper,
Huh?
to people renting out the space in their gardens, for example. Um, uh, the the hotel thing, the Premier Inn and the Travelodge. When did you actually book those?
The Travelodge I booked about probably 6 weeks in advance to get that 26 quid rate at Milton Keynes. The Premier Inn are through lockdown, because I was allowed to travel because of my work. Um, I could take advantage of the fact that Premier Inns were at their lowest rate in lockdown, so I got a lot of cheap rates, a lot of cheap deals then. Premier Inns, like a lot of for a lot of places, the cheap nights are Sunday, and especially in sort of business places or touristy places. So I tend to get my cheapest deals, the 39 quid rooms in Premier Inns on a Sunday night. And obviously, the further ahead you book, the better. So, if you can commit to 2 months away, you can get some good deals.
There's quite a discussion going on about northern trains. Some people think that you're, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, that you're depriving northern trains of income for their fat shareholders. But it has been pointed out that Northern Trains is now state run again. Um, so
As I understand it, delay repay compensation all comes out of the public purse anyway, even for, and I'm sure there are people watching who know far more than I do, but that's what I understand. So, yes, maybe one should feel guilty when one is claiming compensation. Personally, I don't feel guilty at all.
Do you do you hang around York Station looking for dilapidated trains to jump on in the hope that they're going to be delayed, or do you trip train drivers up in the hope that they're going to break their leg and not be able to get on board their train?
No, well, occasionally Northern, like a lot of train operating companies, have flash sales. So I've picked up some £5 and £10 tickets from LNER to go from York to London. I've been up to Scotland for 5 quid in the past. Um, Northern sometimes have this 1 quid flash sale. They didn't do on this winter, but a couple of years ago they did. And it struck me that a lot of, uh, you can buy these £1 tickets. I looked up the stats for how many trains are delayed by more than an hour, and it was certainly a lot more than 10%. So by buying loads of these 1 quid tickets when they have the flash sales, you would be guaranteed to easily make your money back on those services which are late, whether or not you actually used the service, whether or not you went on the train. It could be a way of scoring a load of those cheap complimentary tickets. It's not something I did, and it's not something I'd recommend, but it's an interesting theoretical exercise given the scheme that they run of giving you complimentary tickets. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
and just a quick one about Switzerland. I agree about Switzerland. I was actually with my good friend Nigel, the one who I went to Portugal with. We went to Switzerland last year, and it wasn't prohibitively expensive. It was a bit pricey, but we were staying in hotels. I would say we paid on average about 80 to 120 quid for two people. So, yeah, not cheap, but between two people, yeah, not too bad. We were eating from supermarkets, and it didn't feel an exorbitant place. If And it's the great thing about cycle touring that you're in control to some extent. You can control your expenses, and it's possible to go in these nominally very expensive countries and still be able to have a great time cycle touring because you can control what you spend your money on.
Yeah, I was in Switzerland in 2022, and somebody had contacted me. Now, you're not going to believe this, but his name was Claude Butler, a Swiss chap called Claude Butler. He contacted me, and he said, "Can we meet and cycle for a day?" And I gladly did, and I met him at the top of the Oberalp Pass. And the first thing he said to me, he says, "Andrew, I'm going to pay for everything today because Switzerland is only an expensive country if you don't earn a Swiss salary." And obviously, a secondary school teacher in Britain does not earn a Swiss salary, but he did. So he paid for everything. Now, talking of acts of generosity, Emma, she's written, I'll just read this out. She's written, tip, if you happen to stop in accommodation as a break for camping, as I did, talk to the owners and guests. I expressed uncertainty about my plans due to running out of time to the owner. The next morning, a lift was offered for a small contribution to fuel to take me over 400 kilometres. The guest house also let me use the washing machine for free at this particular place. Conclusion, talk about your plans and needs to others at places of accommodation. It all sounds very reminiscent of Race Around the World, where they kind of rock up at a petrol station and find a lift to go, 400 kilometers down the road.
Yeah, that's really good advice, actually. Yeah, I agree, and I've had similar experiences in the past. Yeah.
Have you ever hitchhiked with a bike?
Uh, a couple of times when we had mechanicals. Yeah, one time in Greece when I had a problem with my bike, and we managed to hitch a lift on a pickup truck who took us probably 50 miles somewhere. So yes, very occasionally.
Mark Skidmore, I can't imagine why I haven't thought of this myself. The French municipal campsite is still going strong. And I found a French municipal campsite in Normandy that charged me €4 to stay for one night in this great little town called, I've forgotten the name of it, but it was in Normandy, brilliant campsite, all the facilities, €4. So seek out the French municipal campsite because it is still going strong. Have you experienced that?
I on in the Loire, when I did the Loire trip last autumn, I stayed at a couple of municipal campsites, but the private ones weren't expensive either. Um, I was generally paying sort of 10 or €12 for perfectly good campsite with all those facilities that I'm sure you've seen many times. There'll be a little wooden hut with the kitchen and the dining facilities for you. There's a little wooden hut with a lounge and maybe some books, and you can recharge all your electricals. Beautiful places to stay, not expensive, well set up for cycling, and yeah, in Britain, those sort of places are few and far between.
Yeah, these recommendations are coming thick and fast. So if you can see the chat, then have a look at them. I'm intrigued. Those two Gregs, by the way, that you had in that picture.
Yes.
Did they meet together behind the nobles as
No,
an amusement?
no, there were separate. There were separate branches. Uh,
Mhm.
but there's only one branch now. I went back a couple of years later, and they'd obviously rationalised it. And somebody had noticed that they had two Gregs so close. Yeah.
Or they could have just bought Noble's amusement and knocked through. Um, have you ever cycled along Scamandin Dam in Yorkshire near me, Route 68?
Yes, I have.
Do you remember the very, very steep climb at the end of Scamandin Dam? It's part of Route 68. I think that might rival your 40% gradient.
Oh, right.
It is phenomenally steep at the end. Um, oh, Domfront. Somebody has just put there. Domfront is the name of the town in Normandy
Ah,
that I was talking about, which is brilliant. Um, uh, and what else have I got here? Um, I suppose time of year is a factor. Gary said right at the beginning, he said he was asked for 75 pounds for a bunk in March on the NCN 500, although March is a bit out of season, but I suppose that's a reflection of the NCN 500. You do a lot of your cycling out of season. Is that a big factor?
What I tend to do is keep the summer for Britain because then I've got more chance of cycle camping. I do a lot of the foreign travel in the shoulder seasons, to March, April, and October, November. I'll try and go to sunny places in the winter. Like that was why I went to the north of Spain. It wasn't hot, but it was a lot more pleasant than here when I went there 2 weeks ago. So, yeah, time of year is certainly a big factor. And because I'm in a position where I can travel off peak a lot, often going Tuesday to Tuesday is a cheaper way of doing it than if you're going weekend to weekend. So yeah, I'm very alive to the cheapest days to book, the cheapest days to play, to stay, the cheapest times of year to go, indeed.
Mm. Nigel, he's written, in my experience, the cost of a cycle tour varies depending on who I'm traveling with. Will they want to go to pricey restaurants every evening, or will they be happy to eat food from supermarkets or eat a cheap doner
Kebab,
box?
yes.
Doner box? Hmm.
Dinner
Um,
box, yes. Hello, Nigel.
uh, I mean, what? Explain that. Is that your friend Nigel?
That's the Nigel
Ah,
whose rear you saw earlier.
right,
Yes,
okay.
and
What is a
luckily,
cheap donor box?
yes, Durner box. It's a little sort of cardboard box about the size of a Durner box, I suppose, about that big, and it's got chips and a Durner meat in it. But it's this strange thing that every doner kebab I've had in continental Europe has been really nice and really good value, and every doner kebab I've had in Britain has been really greasy and unpleasant. So don't judge European doner kebabs by what you've had domestically. Yeah, when I've been with Nigel on bike trips, luckily he's very happy to not go to fancy restaurants, but to have a doner box and maybe even get a couple of cans of beer from the supermarket and go back to the hotel room and watch YouTube videos about cycling and urbanism. So yes, absolutely agree with Nigel. Having somebody who shares your outlook on financial resources can make all the difference between really enjoying a trip and feeling anxious about it because you're either spending more or less than you feel comfortable with.
Yeah. Kathy Chapman has said that she volunteers at festivals, Oxfam, Greenpeace, independent festivals, and they give you free camping. There's also woofing. Have you an experience of woofing? World of Organic Farming, I think it stands for, where you go and you basically you work on the farm, but they give you free accommodation and food for a period of time.
I've never done it myself, but met lots of people who do, and I've only ever heard pleasant things about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that would be good if you wanted to just kind of to base yourself in one area, and perhaps you could come to some agreement to work every other day in return for whatever. So yeah. Right. Anything else? We've got another question. Rob, can you tell us more on delay repay? Deborah asked in the chat about the best way to book trains. Well, I think you did show us that screenshot and
Well, yeah. So there's two conflicting ways you can book trains. So the standard advice is book your train fare as early as you possibly can to get the best price. So it's normally, I think, 3 months, is it? But you can see when you go on to the train company website to book the ticket. And if it's a multi-leg journey, usually it will be much more expensive to book the entire trip as one ticket. Let's say York to York to Bristol No, it's not a good example. Say York to Aberystwyth. If you book it as one ticket, you'll be quoted possibly quite a big price, often because one part of that trip is in peak time, and so the entire trip counts as a peak time trip. But you can go to various websites with names like splitticket.com or Tickety Split or ticket splitting websites, and they will automatically look at the cheapest way of buying leg by leg tickets, and that can often bring the price down very dramatically. There's nothing wrong with it buying, even if it's the same train, you might have three different tickets for the three different constituent parts, and that can save you lots of money because you're only paying the peak rate for the bit that's actually in peak. Now, when it comes to delay repay, it's the train company whose train delayed you that takes the rap for the compensation. And so if the very first leg was northern and they arrived late, which caused you to miss your connection, then you get the entire cost of the trip back. However, if you've booked split tickets, then I don't think the delay repay really counts. I've never tried this. I don't know anybody who has an example, who has experience of this, but I don't think it would, because in that case, if your northern train was late, the other train companies would say, well, you know, you didn't book the entire journey. Our train ran on time. The fact that you missed it was Northern's fault, but you only paid for that ticket for that bit of the journey. So in that case, I don't think you would get your money back. But often when I book my tickets, I will pay for a large leg or maybe even the entire leg because I'm happy to take the to pay for the extra perhaps on the basis that it would probably be late, because from York I often end up going to these places on multi-leg journeys, and as I say, it's about 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 times that I get my money back because it's an hour late. It's that frequent.
Can I give an honorary mention to the Interrail ticket?
Yes.
Because it actually has an interesting impact on traveling in the UK. Because, for example, if you buy a ticket where you travel, you've got 7 days of travel within Europe in a month, for example, you can use the first day, or you can use one of those days of travel at the beginning and the end to travel in your home country. You can't use any of the others, but you can. So in theory, you could live up in Inverness and then you could travel all the way down to Dover at a very cheap rate in order to then access the European network on the mainland, rather than forking out. I dread to think how much it might be from Inverness down to Dover on a train. And then you can do the same in reverse at the end. So the first day and the final day of your journey are actually potentially extremely cheap compared to what you might otherwise pay.
Indeed, and the Interrail special offers, just for people who haven't seen this, around about autumn, you can often buy Interrail tickets, it seems now, regularly for 25 or even more percent discount, and they can be really good deals. And I've bought a few of them. I've got a couple coming up. And that first day, which is free, essentially, if I'm traveling from York to Paris, for example, on Eurostar, you pay a supplement for Eurostar, but the York to London, or even York to Dover, if I'm taking the ferry, York to Dover is all free. And because I'm going in the morning, that would otherwise be a really expensive peak ticket, 80 quid to get down to London on the 7 o'clock morning train, that kind of thing. But it comes free with the Interrail ticket. So yeah, that's well worth keeping in mind that particularly when you set off, you can save maybe 100 quid just on the English leg of your journey, or British leg.
It is now 6 o'clock, and we've got to finish. And at this point in the Martin Lewis show on the TV, he will be speaking at a rate a dozen, because the adverts are about to start. But Max, this is an interesting one. Max Newmagan, and I presume from that name he is perhaps from Germany. He said, "Is train hopping, train surfing done in the UK?" Uh, numbing onto a freight train, getting onto a freight train to get a ride and
Oh,
sneak off when it stops somewhere. I, I'm assuming that's probably legal, but
I think, in a word, no. I've never seen anybody doing it,
yeah.
and so no.
Yeah, I think
I've
that probably is a
never
thing
seen
of the
anybody
past
doing
and
it.
probably highly dangerous.
Yes.
Uh, but anyway, from both your liberty and also your life, just jumping on another train. But anyway, I think I mean, we haven't exhausted. There's loads of stuff in the chat there that people can, especially train recommendations. Um, People talking about the Eurostar, people are talking about going to watch the Tour de France. Um, Lots and lots of ideas there. So just to finish with, Rob, what would be your, if you were to give three, if you were to give your three best top money saving tips for going on a cycle tour, what would they be?
Cycle Camping UK Google Map, because that can really inspire you, um, especially if you're doing a kind of spontaneous last minute. Oh, there's a nice weather window. Let's go cycle camping. Hop on a train, and we can camp here and there. So Cycle Camping UK. Remember, delay repay. If you're lucky enough to live in the northern um, trains network area, use those complimentary tickets. It's enabled me to go to the Dales for free, essentially. Nice weather, I'll take the tent, hop on a train, that's free. Camping, very cheap. And the third one, sorry, but yeah, the Weatherspoons afternoon deal between 2 and 5. Often I've sneaked just before 5 o'clock. I've finished my cycling. I can enjoy a pint and a hot meal for £8, £9, and then I can go to my cheap Travelodge and sit in the bath and have a cup of tea.
So there you go. I think you've just saved us all pounds. You should be on commission of some description. Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for the music. Ah, there's a song there somewhere.
Oh, very good.
Um, uh, and yeah, enjoy your beer, and we'll hopefully see you on the. Oh, you haven't mentioned your website.
I haven't. There's my website, e2e.bike, e2e.bike. So, yes, there's more about those trips that I talked about and all sorts of other stuff. And you can find plenty of inspiring images and blogs and some bad jokes.
And it just flashed up momentarily there. You have an article in the current edition of Cycle magazine, don't you?
There it is, yes, Cycle Magazine. You can read about my Welsh trip, um, and see some of the pictures that you've just seen.
Okay. Well, without further ado, thank you, Rob, um, and enjoy your beer in York, and hopefully we'll catch up very, very soon. So thank you,
Yeah, hope to
and
see.
don't forget to come back in an hour's time for the presentation all about Cambodia, I think, and then later on this evening, the Inner Hebrides. So thank you, and happy cycling.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thank you for